Reconstructed Archive, winter of 1903. In the winter of 1903, there are records of 35 men entering the Valley of Ashes and never returning. They did not all disappear at once. There was no single day of collective panic. What existed was something quieter, slower, and for that very reason, more difficult to perceive as it was happening. The Valley of Ashes lay along the so-called Cumberland Line, an irregular strip of mountainous land that separated small rural communities, coal mines, and poorly documented trade routes. On maps of the time, the place appeared only as a dark fold between hills, unremarkable, with no obvious economic importance. To those passing through, it seemed like just another stretch of harsh winter, bare trees and roads of mud hardened by the cold. It was there that the Ashen sisters lived. Official records do not agree on the exact number of women on the property. Some censuses mention 2, others mention 3. There are also marginal notes suggesting 4 female names linked to the same residence, always written in pencil, always corrected later. What is known with some certainty is that the Ashen sisters were seen as reserved, hard-working women, heirs to a small piece of land left by their father, a former railroad operator who died in the late 1890s. The house was set back from the main trail. It was a low, dark wood structure with narrow windows and a stone annex partially buried in the hillside. In winter, snow often covered half of the side structure, making the property appear smaller than it actually was. Neighbors reported years later that the place swallowed sound. Voices seemed to die before reaching the road. At the beginning of the century, the Cumberland Line was traversed by men in search of temporary work: lumberjacks, displaced miners, traveling salesmen, railroad workers between contracts. Many traveled alone, carrying little more than a suitcase, a letter of recommendation, and the custom of accepting shelter in exchange for small services. The Ashen sisters offered exactly that. There are notes in personal diaries found decades later in family archives describing a clean house, hot food, and makeshift beds near the stove. Nothing in the initial accounts suggests danger. On the contrary, the men write about gratitude, about the comfortable silence, about the strange feeling of deep rest in that region. The problem is that many of these diaries end abruptly. The name Ashen begins to appear with excessive frequency in indirect records. Unanswered letters, work contracts never started, incomplete shipping lists, men who, officially, continued their journey, but never reached their next destination. At the time, no one connected the dots. The region was known for small avalanches, poorly marked trails, common accidents. The disappearance of a lone traveler rarely prompted a formal investigation. 35 disappearances scattered over 2 winters seemed in the archives just a rural statistic, until one detail caught the attention of a district clerk years later. In at least 11 of the cases, the last confirmed location where those men had been seen was the same: a property with no official number, identified only as Ashen Residence, Valley of Ashes. In some records, there is an unsettling addition written in the margin: spent the night. This was the first sign that something had not simply been lost in the snow. And from that point on, Ash Valley ceased to be just a forgotten stretch of the Cumberland Line and became a void in the records, a silence that has not yet been completely filled. Before Ash Valley was associated with absences, it was just a place of passage, a cold corridor between mountains, where the wind blew through the trees as if looking for gaps. In winter, the main road turned into a line of frozen mud, and most men who crossed the Cumberland Line quickly learned that the unwritten rule was simple: walk as far as your body could take you, and accept shelter wherever there was a light on. The Ashen sisters were, for many, that light. The house appeared after a long curve, hidden by a group of dark oak trees. From a distance, it seemed too still, as if it were always waiting. Reports described the same scene: discreet smoke coming out of the chimney, a lantern attached to the porch, and the muffled sound of something being moved inside, like pots or firewood being dragged. The kind of noise that makes a man think, "There's life here." The sisters were not talkative. This appears repeatedly in statements collected later. They spoke softly, offered the essentials, asked short questions, name, destination, whether the traveler was alone. In return, they asked for small favors: chopping wood, carrying water from the well, fixing a door that insisted on slamming in the wind. Nothing unusual for the time, but there was one detail that, over time, was repeated almost ritually. Almost all the men who passed through there mentioned a specific area of the property: the stone annex on the hillside, partially buried, with a low door reinforced with iron. Some called it a storage room. Others called it a chamber. A miner, in a crumpled note found in a coat pocket years later, wrote only, "A winter room, cold outside, warm inside." In the sisters' routine, this annex seemed to be the silent heart of the house. More distant neighbors, who rarely went there but saw the property from afar, reported something that, at the time, was interpreted as zeal. The Ashens almost never let visitors circulate freely. They led the men from the threshold of the porch inside, and from inside to the makeshift room, always with the same economy of gestures. It wasn't hostility. It seemed precaution. The winter of 1902 was particularly harsh. The mines reduced shifts. Railroad work fluctuated. Many men wandered between counties with vague promises of employment. It was during this season that the flow of solitary travelers grew, and with it, the number of names that would later be crossed off lists. There are letters that describe these men's exhaustion with an almost painful honesty. A woodcutter named Elias Turner wrote to his sister in January 1903, saying that his fingers no longer obeyed him in the cold and that he needed a bed for a whole night without dreaming of hunger. In the same letter, he mentions hearing about some women who don't charge money, only service. He ends with a simple sentence: "If I get there, I'll write again." He didn't write. Still, for weeks, nothing seemed out of the ordinary to those around him. Rural life absorbed absences like the earth absorbs water, without fanfare. A man who didn't return could have fallen into a ravine. He could have changed his route. He could have found a job and left without saying goodbye. In 1903, the idea of disappearing did not carry the same weight as it does now. There were no traces, no centralized records, no newspaper photograph for every face. And the Ashen sisters remained there, discreet, almost invisible. There is a specific account, collected decades later, that stands out because it does not speak of violence or threat. It speaks of sensation. A woman named Mabel Crow, who lived a few miles away, claimed that she once brought flour to the property in the late afternoon. She said that one of the Ashen sisters opened the door just enough to receive the bag, and that behind her, the air in the house seemed still, not hot, not cold, still, as if the interior were holding its breath. Mabel also said she heard a low, continuous sound coming from somewhere below the floor or the hillside. Not a scream, not a voice. A sound like wood working under pressure or something heavy being dragged very slowly. She didn't mention it to anyone at the time, because in the countryside, people keep their impressions as they keep their grief, in silence. Another testimony, this one from a man who survived because he did not spend the night there, is even more revealing. He said he arrived at dusk and asked for shelter. The sisters offered him soup and let him warm himself by the stove. While he was eating, he noticed that there were damp patches in the corners of the floor, as if the cold outside was rising in patches through the wood. He asked casually if the house had a basement. The answer came too quickly. Not for visitors. In this phrase, repeated in different versions, appears in at least 3 indirect accounts. And yet, even with these subtle signs, what dominated the descriptions was normality. The soup, the fire, the respectful silence, the tiredness that made any strangeness seem just part of the world. Until, at the end of February 1903, a small event, small enough to go almost unnoticed, occurred and changed the way the records were read. A man named Harold Baines, a temporary line operator, was seen on a Sunday morning crossing the trail with a short suitcase and a worn coat. He was recognized by 2 young men returning from town with groceries. They talked for a few minutes. Harold said he intended to reach the next station before nightfall, but that he might stop at the women's house if the snow got heavy. The snow did get heavy. That night, a lamp was seen lit on the Ashen's porch later than usual. A distant neighbor crossing the road in a wagon reported hearing a metallic sound, like chains rattling or a bolt being adjusted, coming from the direction of the stone outbuilding. The next morning, the trail near the property showed footprints. Many. But what was recorded, and this appears in a local hunter's notebook, was something else. The footprints led to the door of the house, and there were no footprints coming out. The hunter did not call the authorities. He wrote it down in his notebook and moved on. Maybe he thought the snow had covered the exit. Maybe he thought the man was sleeping there. Maybe he didn't want to get involved. But that simple, cold note would, decades later, become the opening line for everything that was to come. Because Harold Baines was the first case where the last confirmed report was not just near the valley, it was in front of the door. And in the files next to his name, someone wrote in pencil with a trembling hand, "Went in, didn't come out." Harold Baines's disappearance did not cause an immediate stir. On the Cumberland Line, men came and went with irregular frequency. Still, something changed in the reports from that winter on. Not in the newspapers, which barely mentioned the case, but in the margins of documents, in interrupted diaries, in letters never sent. The silence began to take shape. In the weeks that followed, other men were seen entering the Valley of Ashes under similar conditions. Alone, tired, carrying little. The pattern was not in the number, but in the interval. The absences began to occur with strange regularity, almost as if they obeyed the rhythm of the most intense cold. Always at night, always after the last snowfall of the day, always when the wind made a return unlikely. The records allow us to reconstruct, with some accuracy, the last night of at least 5 of these men. The similarity between the accounts is disturbing in its simplicity. They arrived at dusk. The light from the lamp served as a guide. The sisters opened the door just enough to see who was outside. There was no rush. There was no exaggerated welcome. There was assessment. Inside the house, the air was thick. There were no drafts. The fire remained low, steady, without loud crackling. One of the accounts mentions that the silence was so complete that one could hear one's own blood in one's ears. Another speaks of a smell that is difficult to identify. Not rotten, not strong. Something between old dampness and cold iron. After the meal, the same invitation always came. The sisters suggested that the traveler sleep more protected, especially on nights with a biting wind. They said that the makeshift rooms near the stove did not hold the cold of dawn well. The stone annex, according to them, had been built by their father to get through the harshest winters, a place where the cold did not easily enter, a stable place. This is where the records become fragmented, because none of these men left a complete account of what happened next. What exists are reconstructions based on indirect testimonies, customs of the time, and traces found years later. The annex had a low door which forced any man to bend down to enter. The ceiling was made of rough stone. The floor was made of beaten earth, covered with movable boards. In winter, the temperature difference was noticeable. The space maintained a dry heat, strange for a buried environment. It did not come from an open fire, but from something contained, possibly heated stones, possibly a simple closed ventilation system. The sounds, according to one of the few surviving descriptions, were almost completely muffled. On the night Harold Baines disappeared, the weather was described as motionless. It snowed lightly, but the cold hardened the air. A distant neighbor reported waking up with a feeling of pressure in his ear, like before a storm that never came. He said that around midnight he heard something he couldn't explain. Not a scream, not a cry for help, but a short vibration, as if something heavy had been moved and then slotted into place. There was no more sound after that. What makes this reconstruction even more disturbing is what does not appear in the reports. There is no mention of struggle, blood, or escape. Everything indicates that the process was quick, silent, perhaps even accepted in the first few minutes. Exhausted men tend to obey instructions without question, especially when offered calmly and with conviction. The last confirmed material evidence directly linked to the mass disappearance emerged in early March 1903. After a heavy snowfall, a local hunter found a dark leather suitcase partially exposed near the hillside behind the property. It was intact. Inside were carefully folded clothes, a hairbrush, a small notebook without a cover, and an unfinished letter. The handwriting matched that of Harold Baines, later compared with work documents. The contents of the letter were never published in full, but an excerpt appears in a district report years later. The women say that winter here does not reach the body. It is strange to trust this, but I am too tired to be suspicious. The suitcase was too clean to have been abandoned. There were no animal tracks. There were no signs of dragging. Someone had placed it there, or left it there deliberately. In the days that followed, more objects began to appear, always after snowfalls: a hat, a single boot, a belt buckle. Never two items together. Never anything that would allow a body in motion to be reconstructed. It was as if the valley returned just enough to remind us that someone had been there. When the authorities were finally notified, it was no longer a single man, nor two. A clerk added up the names, crossed off different lists, and arrived at the number that appears today in the official records: 35 men missing in less than 20 months, all with confirmed passage on the Cumberland Line, and almost all with an indirect connection to the same property. The official visit took place on a clear morning, with deep snow and a clear sky. 2 agents, accompanied by a local resident, arrived at the Ashen sisters' house. They found the door closed. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. There were no recent footprints. The silence was so absolute that one of the men later noted that it looked like a place abandoned for decades. When they finally entered, the house was empty, too tidy, no dirty dishes, no clothes out of place, as if someone had carefully ended a routine. The stone annex was locked from the inside. They had to force the door open. What the records describe from that point on does not speak of explicit horror. They speak of absence, of marks on the floor that made no sense, of old dampness impregnated in the walls, of a space prepared to withstand weight, silence, and prolonged cold. But there were no bodies, and that, perhaps, was the most disturbing detail of all. The absence of bodies was the first obstacle, and also the first official silence. With no remains, no direct witnesses, and no confession, the case was filed as inconclusive before it was even fully investigated. Still, something had changed. For the first time, Ash Valley was no longer just a forgotten spot on the Cumberland Line and began to be observed. The Ashen sisters' property was isolated for a few days. Men from the region were called in to assist in the search, not as investigators but as laborers. They dug around the house, tested the soil on the hillside, and descended to points where the snow seemed to give way easily. Nothing was found but compacted earth, ancient stones, and frozen water seeping into deep layers. The stone annex, however, became the center of attention. Reports describe a space designed with more care than the rest of the house. The interior walls showed signs of wear inconsistent with simple storage. There were vertical grooves in the stone, spaced irregularly, as if something had been pressed repeatedly against them. The dirt floor was deeper in the center, indicating constant weight over time. One detail caught the attention of one of the agents: the ventilation system. There were simple, narrow ducts, almost invisible from the outside, which allowed minimal air circulation without allowing sound. A rudimentary but effective method. It was not something that was built by chance. It was something that was planned. Still, planning is not a crime, and without direct evidence, all they had were interpretations. The community reacted in a divided manner. Some neighbors refused to believe in any involvement by the sisters. They argued that single women at that time lived under constant suspicion, and that it was easier to blame them than to accept that men got lost in the winter. Others, however, began to revisit old memories, small episodes that in isolation never seemed relevant. A wagon seen leaving the property late at night, without a lantern. A metallic smell in the air on very cold mornings. The repetitive sound of something being closed, always coming from the hillside. These accounts emerged only after the valley was mentioned in official records. Before that, No one had spoken, not out of overt fear, but out of habit. At the turn of the century, silence was a form of social survival. The Ashen sisters were never found. There were no travel records, no railroad tickets, no job applications in neighboring counties. It was as if they had been erased along with the last winter. Some believed they had run away. Others suggested they had distant relatives. There were even those who said they had died in the cold, somewhere in the mountains. But one specific document, found years later in a secondary archive, adds a disturbing layer to the story. It is an incomplete inventory of the property, made months after the official visit. In it, the stone annex is described as a winter chamber for preservation. Not food, not tools, just preservation. The term is not explained, it is not corrected, just underlined. Another detail emerges in later testimonies. Some of the missing men had small amounts of cash in common, which were never recovered. Nothing that would justify systematic theft. Nothing that would explain 35 disappearances. It was too little to be the reason, but enough to raise an uncomfortable hypothesis. The revelation, when it came, was not a single moment. It was an accumulation. Investigators began to consider that what had happened in Val das Cinzas was not an isolated event, nor an act of impulsive violence. It was a process, slow, repeated, sustained by the cold, isolation, and human predictability. Tired men accept shelter. Isolated men are not sought after. Winter erases traces better than any human effort. The Ashen sisters, according to this interpretation, did not act with visible brutality. They acted methodically. They created a space where the human body was no longer urgent, where time worked for them. What happened inside the chamber is not explicitly described in any document, and perhaps never will be. But the traces indicate restraint, not confrontation. Silence, not chaos. There are no records of screams reported. There are no reports of struggle. Only progressive disappearances, fitting into the normality of a territory where single men always disappear. When the case was officially closed in 1906, the final text contains a short, almost defensive sentence. It was not possible to establish individual responsibility, but in the following years, something curious happened. The flow of travelers on the Cumberland Line decreased dramatically. Men began to avoid the Valley of Ashes, not by official order, by whispered conversation, by vague recommendations, by that ancient form of warning that needs no proof to spread. The sisters' house was partially demolished in 1911. The stone annex, however, was not destroyed. It was too heavy, fused to the hillside. To this day, on old maps, the site is marked only as unstable terrain. Unstable not because of the soil, but because of what was buried in the records. Decades later, when winters were no longer so long and the Cumberland Line had lost its importance, the Valley of Ashes still appeared in the archives as a blank space. There were no official photographs of the Ashen sisters' house, no confirmed images of the interior of the chamber. What remained were words scattered on fragile papers, written by hands that did not know they were recording something that would outlive them. As a historian, I learned early on that the past rarely shouts. It manifests itself in flaws, in discrete repetitions, in patterns that only reveal themselves when someone decides to look slowly. The case of the Ashen sisters never offered a complete truth. There was no trial. There was no confession. There was no closure in the human sense of the word. What there was a series of small decisions made by ordinary people, at a time when disappearing was almost a possible fate. The men who crossed the Valley of Ashes were not reckless. They were tired. They trusted because they needed to trust. They accepted shelter because the body demands warmth before it demands explanations. In each of them, there was an interrupted story that no one claimed with sufficient urgency. The sisters, for their part, do not appear in the records as monsters. They appear as functional figures, silent, adapted to their environment, capable of transforming isolation into method. There is no evidence of pleasure, nor of fury, only continuity. a system maintained as long as winter allowed. When the stone annex was finally sealed years later, one of the workers wrote something in his notebook that never made it into the official reports. He wrote that when closing the entrance, he had the impression that the place was not empty, not in the physical sense but in the sense of memory, as if the space had learned to keep what passed through it. Today, when revisiting these documents, I cannot say with certainty the fate of each of the 35 men. What I can say is that they all existed. They walked, they spoke to someone for the last time, and they trusted that specific point on the map. The Valley of Ashes did not become famous. It did not become a popular legend. It did not make it into school books. Perhaps because it does not offer a clear ending. Perhaps because there is no easy villain to point to. What remained was silence. A silence built little by little, sustained by the cold, the distance, and the administrative indifference of a time when men alone left no echo. Every time I read the word, "spent the night," in the margins of the records, I remember that sleeping is an act of surrender, and that sometimes history is written at the very moment someone decides to rest. The stone annex is still there, they say, too buried to be removed, too integrated into the hillside to be ignored. Not as a monument, but as a discrete scar on the territory. And perhaps that is how certain events remain, not as clear warnings, but as places where the map is blank and the silence continues to work.